and it never happened. And tonight Karen came through big time with one of the better lasagnas I've ever had. So thank you, Karen. It was delicious. Did you make it yourself? I did. It was awesome. So thank you, Reagan, Rob. Gone. All right. So let's go ahead and get started with the City Council work session. December 17th, we're going to go a little out of order tonight. And we're going to start with a wastewater treatment plant capacity study. We'll hear from staff.
Thank you, Mayor. Good evening, members of Council. We would normally expect for the plant as we had planned for it to operate. They raised the question, as I'm glad they did, and we were able to reach out to Patrick and his team, and they were able to conduct analysis to kind of verify, validate what we're seeing, and check out a whole bunch of other things, and then come back to us with the memo that you see in your packet tonight, with their findings about plant capacity and how we're doing so far. So with that, I'm going to ask Patrick to provide an overview of their work and their findings, and then we'll come back at the end and talk about kind of next steps from here.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. So as Jim said, we're going to talk briefly about a summary of our capacity evaluation, and we're going to get relatively technical for a little bit, so if you have any questions, please stop me right where we're at, and we'll go back. So kind of the agenda for the presentation, we're going to talk a little bit about the planning study, how we developed some of the criteria, what went into the planning study. We're going to talk about the development of the design criteria that we have for the wastewater plant, the current data from the wastewater plant, how the plant's currently operating, some steps moving forward, and then some conclusions and recommendations. So with the planning study, first we're going to talk about some definitions. We're going to run through that. It'll be really fun. We're talking about the goals of the planning study, design criteria, development, and then current data, some operations, and moving forward. All this we're going to cover. So moving forward, some of the definitions. So one of the things you're going to hear me talk about is BOD. BOD is a surrogate measure of organic content of the wastewater. We don't have a really good way to quantify how much organic matter is in wastewater because it's 50, 100,000 different compounds. We just measure it as one thing, call it BOD. We basically put it in a jar, measure how much oxygen it takes to degrade it, and that's our number. Ammonia, it's really present. It's a really common compound in wastewater. It's toxic to fish. For if any of you are trout fisher people, ammonia is really toxic to trout. Its most common source in wastewater is urine. Phosphorus is also another nutrient present in wastewater treatment plants. So we're going to talk about ammonia and phosphorus, how they relate to treatment plants here in a little bit, because all the regulations are going to nutrient removal. Phosphorus is present in municipal wastewater, and it results in algal blooms. And I'm sure a lot of you have heard about some of the algal blooms or the big algae problem they have in the Gulf of Mexico. That's attributed to this phosphorus in the wastewater, phosphorus in general. Mixed liquor suspended solids, Robbie uses that to quantify how well his treatment's doing. It's a measure of how much treatment capacity he has and how he's able to treat things. Biosolids is the product that we have from biological wastewater treatment. So much like when we eat food, right, we're going to defecate, we're going to urine. It's the same kind of process. We give these bacteria food, they also produce a product. We're going to talk about anaerobic treatment a little bit. Anaerobic treatment is biological treatment without oxygen or nitrate present. We're going to talk about anoxic treatment, where it's treatment where we're going to use nitrate, much like we use oxygen to breathe. These bacteria use nitrate to breathe. Aerobic treatment, which is biological treatment with oxygen. And two other terms that may come up are autotrophs, which don't eat carbon for cell growth, and heterotrophs, which eat carbon for cell growth. May not do it, but if they come up in discussion, I want to have them written down here that we have them aware. So the planning study from 2014 to 2015. In that, we basically laid out the project goals working with city staff. And some of the goals that we defined right off the bat were we want to reduce the flood risk because we had in 2013, the Evans wastewater treatment facility was basically underwater from the flood. We want to meet Regulation 85 effluent limits, and we're going to talk about regulations here in a couple slides. We want to improve process control. By that, it allows Robbie and his staff to monitor the plant remotely so that they can go to bed at night, they can be away on the weekends, and if something goes wrong, they just get a phone call and they can come in. We want to support projected population growth. We're going to talk a lot about that. And then we develop design criteria using population projections, flow and load projections, because that helps us define how big this treatment plant needed to be. A little bit about the alternatives analysis to get where we were, or how we decided what we want, and then the recommendations out of that planning study, which were basically a lift station and force main at the Evans site to the Hill and Park site, and then in Headworks, Johannesburg process clarifies UV disinfection, anaerobic sludge lagoon. So this graph here, this is a summary of the planning study population projections. City staff, Jessica Gonifas and DeTesco, we worked with them to come up with these population projections. And what it basically said is we're going to go from a population of 19,000 and some change to 25,000 and some change over the 20-year planning life of the project. With corresponds to a population gain of 5,000, almost 200 people. A majority of that growth was projected to occur in the Hill and Park Basin. We're going to come back to this figure here in a little bit, so just remember that. One of the other things we wanted to do was look at the regulatory environment. So the EPA has been looking at regulating nutrients, both ammonia, nitrogen, and phosphorus, from wastewater treatment plants and point sources since the late 1980s. And they've been pushing on state government agencies to get these implemented. Since 2012, the state of Colorado has been very progressive in moving towards implementing their policies. In 2012, they implemented Regulation 85, which set technology-based effluent limits for nutrients of 1 milligram per liter total phosphorus, 15 milligrams per liter total inorganic nitrogen, and that is the sum of ammonia, nitrate, and nitrite. At the same time, they passed Regulation 31, which is a water quality-based standard, which is where they looked at what happens when we add nutrients to water and how much does it impact aquatic life. And if it impacts aquatic life at the small microscopic level, it's going to impact then trout or the larger life forms in that stream or river. Those limits are a lot lower and very, very difficult to achieve. To achieve those limits, if we had achieved those limits with our plant now, we would be looking at spending $10 to $15 million, and that would be very difficult to meet, in addition to very expensive ongoing chemical usage that we'd have to do. That's very expensive. In 2017, the state went back and said, you know what, those Reg 31 limits are very tight, and they wrote up a policy, a voluntary incentive program, they call it, Policy 17-1, that says if you, Mr. or Mrs. Treatment Plant Operator, can produce a little bit higher quality effluent of 0.7 total phosphorus, 7 milligrams per liter total organic nitrogen, will allow you to postpone those very strict Regulation 31 limits up to 10 years. Robbie and his staff are going to talk about how they're operating right now here later on in the presentation, but meeting that policy is very important. So when we designed this facility, we were looking at trying to achieve Reg 85 limits and slightly better so that we could set the plan up to meet Reg 31, but we didn't want to spend the capital to meet Reg 31 then because it would be not needed for a while. Reg 31, the state of Colorado is looking at putting those limits into discharge permits starting in 2032 unless you can meet the policy requirement, the requirements of 17-1, and then it allows you to put you off to 2042. That's the giant summary. Do better now, postpone it as far as you can. Alrighty, so when we were going through the planning study, now we're throwing a lot of numbers at you, I'm sorry, but this is a pretty technical way and I just want to get everybody up to speed here as fast as possible. This is a graph showing the historical wastewater usage from 2005 to 2014 when we were doing the planning study. As you can see, our average flow averaged about 1.5 MGD, slightly more, and we look at the maximum month, the average day and the maximum month flow is one of the design parameters we look at, and those two generally track, so the data is generally pretty good. Next, we looked at the historical average BOD5 load and concentration. So between 2005 and 2017, influent BOD concentration ranged from 254 to 291. You can see it's generally pretty consistent, and those influent concentrations are very consistent with what we see with other Front Range communities. Very consistent. So if you remember, BOD is the surrogate measure of organic compounds. That's about how much organic matter you're having. I mean, maybe. Seem to have lost power. There we go. So one of the things we look at when we're trying to project forward how big we need to make treatment plants, we look at how much organic matter and how much flow people use historically and then use their population projections to project that forward. So this chart is a historical average of the per capita wastewater production and organic matter production that each person did in the city of Evans from 2005 to 2014. So our historical average wastewater flow contribution, it was 85 gallons per capita per day, slightly below what we've seen for other Front Range communities. Most people are in the 95 to 105 range, but there's nothing wrong with that. That just means you guys are really good at conserving your water. Historical average BOD production of 0.15 is about where we see it in other Front Range communities. Almost every Front Range community I have worked with is between 0.18 and 0.21. So it's right at the ballpark. We're going to speak more about this, though, coming up when we talk about how we're actually working. So as I mentioned, we took the population projections that we developed, multiplied it by these per capita flow and load contributions to develop our design criteria to set the capacity for the new plant. Though the capacity of the new plant is the bold numbers in this chart of 2.88 MGD and 6,024 pounds per day of BOD. So you might want to write those numbers down, so we'll talk a lot about those numbers. So then, as Jim mentioned, we brought the plant online, and Robbie was like, guys, the BOD is really high. The BOD is really high. And we thought, okay, maybe we have the sampling point in the wrong problem. Maybe we were just getting little suspended solids of stuff getting stuck in the sampler, and that was maybe affecting our results. So we worked with Robbie to get the sampler in the right spot, and the data from January to August of this year is very consistent, and that data we feel is correct. But regardless, you can see that we're operating about 80% of the planned organic capacity. I'll do the math for you real quick. At the 80% of design capacity, the EPA in the state of Colorado written into your discharge permit is that you need to start planning for upgrades to your treatment facility. At which point Jim called us, Randy, and Robbie called us, like, this can't be, something's wrong. And now we're going to talk about some of the things going with that. So here's the BOD that we've seen since we turned the plant online. We've ranged from 4,400 to 5,700 pounds per day. That's a lot of BOD. So the two lines, those dashed lines on the chart, the bottom dashed line is the 80% capacity line for BOD. The top one is your permitted capacity. So you can see we're operating right around our 80% planning level of BOD. The EPA and CDPHE strongly encourage you at that point in time to start planning. They don't strongly really enforce it. They basically leave it up to you. And then if something goes wrong and you overcapacity later on, they can point the finger at you and say, we recommended you do this. So what changed? So between 2005 and 2017, right? We're just looking at the data. We all want to know what happened. So between 2005 and 2014, the average BOD ranged from 254, it's the blue line, to 291 milligrams per liter. The dashed white line is our current average BOD concentration. Almost 100 milligrams per liter difference. Wow, that just doesn't happen overnight. In fact, that doesn't happen unless something drastically changes. And we're going to talk about potential sources of that here coming up. But that was one thing we found. Holy moly, why is this? The other thing, we started talking to Jim and Randy and Robbie. The population of Evans right now is at 23,000 people, where we've already led in almost 4,000 people, and we are only going to, the planning horizon population was only going to be a little over 5,000 people. So we've let in 65% of the people already that we said we were going to do over the 20-year horizon. We did it in a year and a half. Oh, wow. So from a capacity standpoint, we're operating right now as we're in like 2028 versus 2019. Because we more people came to the city of Evans than were planned for in the planning horizon. So when we look at the operating data, diving into the data a little bit more, if we look at the average per capita BOD concentration, historically we were at 0.19, now we're operating at 0.21. People are generating more. Why is that? Well, we'll talk about that. The per capita flow, that dropped. We designed for 90, now we're looking at 72. So that, if you drop your flow and increase your load, that impacts concentration. The BOD concentration, we designed for a BOD max month of 320. We're operating at an average of 379 or 373. Our ammonia drives the size of the process. It's really prevalent in urine. We sized the process to handle 36. We're getting 41. So a lot more load is coming into the plant than what was designed for. We don't really know why, other than the population increased. So what does this mean? The city of Evans grew faster than anticipated. We're also planning on, the city's also planning on incorporating another 1,900 residents in the next several years, which it corresponds to about 5,500 people. The BOD is extremely strong, stronger than other Front Range communities. Now, why is that? There's two potential reasons that can come to mind. One, there's a potential for an industrial commercial discharger. I have one client that they can be operating just fine, and when this industrial discharger discharges, their influent BOD jumps to 400. They just happen to have a hummus maker in town who doesn't like to operate their pretreatment facility. So when the hummus maker doesn't operate their pretreatment facility, their BOD goes from 280 almost up to 400 overnight. We don't know. We need to maybe conduct some sampling. We'll talk here about that in a few minutes. Another potential source is if the city added a bunch of high-density housing. Basically, we were operating at 80% capacity, and one of the things is that they need to start planning for capacity improvements. So let's talk about current operations. So Robbie turned this plant on, and the plant's operating great. Robbie, so on this chart, we've got total inorganic nitrogen, and it's kind of noisy, but generally speaking, Robbie has it operating below 7 milligrams per liter. The light blue line is phosphorus, and generally Robbie has that operating below 0.7. What that means is Robbie is operating the plant well enough that we can push off those really strict Reg 31 limits, which is a huge benefit for the city. So kudos to Robbie and his operators over there. That delay itself will be very significant. So The plant's operating really great. The staff is doing a great job with it. We're just farther along in our capacity than we anticipated. So what can we do? Step one, can we re-rate the facility, get a little more capacity out of it by tweaking it? When we designed the facility, we didn't have the best operational data. The data was a little bit suspect, and we used the plant operating data that we've gathered in 18 months of operation, weather influent data, went back and tweaked the model and able to achieve a little bit more capacity. We can get an additional 600 pounds per day of BOD, which is a 10% increase. To do this, we're gonna have to submit a site application, a regulatory document to CDPHE. Not that big a deal, but just a process we have to go to. It won't fundamentally change the process. It just is something we need to do on paper. Some additional steps. Step two, we can pilot test some process intensification technology. There are some technologies out there that allow us to do more with less. Yes, this sounds great. Everything doesn't come for free. There are going to be costs to Robbie and increased operational expenses. But there will need to be a study done to determine if a process intensification technology is better than maybe going with a more conventional technology which requires additional land. We can pilot test one of those, which allows us to dial in design criteria for the expansion. That's one step. Another step, we can sample in the collection system with the goal of trying to identify high-strength commercial industrial dischargers. Maybe the city of Evans does have a hummus maker somewhere, and what they can do is sample up the collection system, and we can eventually track them down and nail down who's discharging, and then we can, as step 4 says, set up an industrial pretreatment program so that the city of Evans can then surcharge these high BOD users or push them to put in a treatment technology to get their BOD loads within a more reasonable limit. The last step is planning for expansion, where we have to update the population projections. Most recent data and discussions with city staff indicates a population north of 30,000 people within the planning horizon. We only counted 25,000. Significant increase. Finding a way to accommodate that. Doing an alternatives analysis, whether we look at a process intensification technology or more conventional process. Which one will be more cost effective? With the larger expansion, we'd likely have to do solids handling. Right now, Robbie sends the waste generated in his process to anaerobic sludge lagoons. They are not an ideal process. It was a way to keep costs down in the first phase, and it would work for the first phase, but as we get bigger, it will not work. So some conclusions and recommendations. So in the past 3 years, the city of Evans has incorporated 65% of its population growth that was accounted for in the planning study of the wastewater plant. The data suggests that we have a high-strength discharger, or one may be present and may be accounting for elevated BOD concentrations and loads of the treatment plant. So if we're able to find this discharge, or if one exists, we can get back some capacity. We can do a paper re-rate and submit that to CDPHE and gain the city a little bit more extra room to breathe. Develop a collection system monitoring program and industrial discharge program. And make it a priority to maximize postponement of Reg 31 upgrades by meeting the policy goals of 17-1, which Rob and his staff are already doing, but keeping that moving forward. And then the last one is start the facility planning process. And with that, I'd open it up to any questions for myself or my coworker Laura. She's in the back, or she's over on the side.
Comments. Could you go back to those options to the slide with, I think, step 2 top?
There we go.
So we have some time and we have some steps here, and I just want to point out order of magnitude, and Patrick can certainly jump in, but a full capital project approach, and I'll be real general here in terms of cost, because one of our next steps is to kind of hone in on that cost a little more, but say order of magnitude if the next build out of the plant would be $5 to $10 million. Some of the process intensification options that you saw on the slide could be a tenth of that.
I would say there'll be in the 5 to 10 range. The other one would be double.
Yeah,
Double.
so like a biomag
Biomag would be 5 to 10-ish.
million.
Yeah.
Okay, so one of our next steps is really to start understanding what those options are and what those costs are. I think Patrick's also outlined some of the steps we can take to get a little bit more capacity sooner in terms of the re-rating and industrial pretreatment program that we need to really understand some of the other causes that we're seeing. So from staff standpoint, we would request council's direction to follow through with this, following your questions and any other goals that you might have for us, but to move as quickly as we can to some of that project scoping so that we can include any of those capital or improvements that we're going to need into our system development charges, our impact fees that are paid by new development, so that those can be paid as much by new residents and growth as possible. Just kind of back of the napkin conversation, I think it's at this point possible to cover much of those kinds of improvements with our next round of system development fee updates, but we need to get that data soon so that we can come back to you with what those rates need to be. So that would be, I guess, staff's request after your questions would just be to go out and get working on these capacity issues.
Thanks, Jim. Questions of staff?
I would like to see, and this is just me, and I know it's kind of probably far out there, but the technology aspect, instead conventional versus technology. I know there's also out there technology where you can kind of utilize the sludge as a renewable source. And I know Bill Gates created this $50,000 machine in a third world country. It's where they use the sludge and then we're able to make drinking water out of it, drinkable. And he even drank it too, which was kind of interesting. I'm can you drink it? Okay, I think we're kind of good. But just granted, not something like that, but maybe seek out something that we can do with it. And I know we go out there and give it or sell it.
Give it away to farmers.
Well, yeah, which is a good thing too. But I just think finding alternatives of how we can utilize that sludge. And again, it's kind of far out there too, but it's just to see if there's anything out there that's there's some cost savings, but then also utilize maybe still give it to the farmers, but still do something else with it. I don't know.
So there's a couple things that can be happening with sludge. A big one is land application, which we talked about. There is some other things you can do where you can take this sludge and you can produce power, and that sounds great. That sounds great, but typically those type of systems don't pay for themselves in this size treatment facility until your power costs are in the 13 to 14 cent a kilowatt hour. And I guess we were at 7 or 8.
Okay.
So when we get up to 13 to 14, it starts to have a payback period. But until then, it costs so much money to build and construct those facilities that there's no real economic payback. Well, from a green perspective, it's great.
Yeah.
There are also now a couple of treatment facilities in the world, one most notably in Austria, that is carbon neutral, but that also costs a lot of money to get there, and it's not necessarily cost effective to complete. But the technology is going there, and it's very exciting.
That's the key thing.
So back to our problem. My question for you is, what's happening with the sludge from the old wastewater treatment plant?
Robbie?
Is it being pumped up to the new one?
No, it's currently in
Okay.
for lack of a better term, storage right now.
Okay, because I was wondering if that was our hummus plant.
No, we did dewater the old Evans lagoons into the lift station, but that was pulling the surface water, which on average was about 20 milligrams per liter in BOD. So it wasn't a big driver, and we went very slowly. We averaged maybe 100,000 gallons a day as we dewatered those.
So the other two things I have to say, I just find it very, very interesting that our population has gone up about 4,000 people in 4 years. So that's about 1,000 homes times 4 people a home. That just seems like it's a lot compared to the growth that I've noticed traveling through the city. With that being said, well, there's two other things. They said the majority of the growth is in the Hill and Park basin. A lot of that is in the county. Are we going to get county help with any of our, offsetting any of our costs to expand? And I mean, that's something for you guys to think about, because I'm not expecting for you to have answers. The other thing I just wanted to say is it's very upsetting that we have a $37 million plant that's been in operation for 18 months and we are already at capacity. I'm just kind of wondering what the planning was, and I know several of you guys have been involved in it, but it just seems that they're, just it's a little bit of a lack in the planning, and I certainly don't want it to be another case that in 18 more months after we expand, that we're back here at the table saying, well, we thought it was going to be 5 years, 10 years, and now it's only 18 months. It seems like that area where the wastewater treatment plant's at is a little cramped for space as it is right now. So I just wanted to make that comment publicly.
I would like to know, I was reading in here about that Greeley is going to be building a lift station to transfer wastewater from the St. Michael's area out of Evans. What kind of capacity would that free up as well? And two, you talked about trying to target possibly, a hummus. How would you try to target that to see if that's also part of the issue as well? How would you be able to target that?
We would start very broad. We can narrow down 2 collection systems in essence. That's kind of the advantage to having that lift station. So we'll target our high strength BOD in those separate collection systems and then think of it as a tree. The plants, the base of the tree, we just keep branching and testing those zones where those bigger trunk lines come in and sit there and follow it back until we find the source in essence.
Well, along that lines too, I mean, you mentioned that St. Michael's, we're getting influx from St. Michael's, we're getting influx from the Hill and Park region, which is county. We're looking at impact fees to pay for the expansion. Why are we not maybe charging these other outside entities a little bit more than our residents?
Yeah.
As far as the billing, I can't speak to that. I think a lot of it comes down to, as we started looking at population, I think where some of that population growth might have came from is I think the St. Michael's subdivision got missed in planning.
Yeah,
And
again,
there's
that's
been
really, so,
a lot of fill-in
I-
in that subdivision as
yeah.
well.
and I understand that, that's bumping into ours, but I just don't understand why we are going to be responsible for adding on, and Greeley needs to be held accountable for that.
Exactly.
Could you explain their lift station
Yes.
plan and also the question about rough percentage or amount of relief that might be gained from their coming off of our system in a couple of years?
So the lift station, we don't have exact numbers. That's going to be one of our first sampling points, honestly, is to see exactly what is coming from St. Michael's. We just got the sampling equipment in the last couple of months, get working on training and get that sampled. So for true numbers, but we can estimate about 400 units that is in that St. Michael's subdivision right now. Rough math, 3 people per unit, that's 1,200 people. If you use rough math, 100 gallons per day, which we know we're a lot lower than that. Sorry, I can pull out a calculator if you want real accurate numbers.
All right, I think that's the estimate that will help, put it in perspective for that load, that they're planning to build their lift station within, is it 2 to 3 years in their CIP? So,
Cobblestone development is happening west of the hospital.
so once they've built that, then that'll come off of our plant.
Does our IGA specify anything about
Just
capacity
capacity,
during that? Like,
yeah.
Yeah.
because what, to Laura's point, in, the questions I wrote down were the same. How does this consider, or what is the impact of St. Michael's? I was assuming that wasn't considered in the original plan, which I understand to a point, but at the same time, then when that IGA was brought on to service them prior to this lift station being built, I think there should be some form of capacity outreach there,
Right.
because
Yeah.
the negative thing would be if we hit a point of capacity that we're forced to go into this expansion mode and spending all of this money because we're servicing residents of Greeley, that becomes detrimental to the residents of Evans. So I would really love to see how that IGA impacts us and what our options are relative to that agreement.
Exactly.
What
I
we're
mean,
talking
over
about,
the
St.
past-
Michael's, is that including the hospital?
No,
No.
the hospital's not
No,
coming.
more along the line of that point there too. I mean, obviously, with our water treatment and everything like that, Greeley would charge us if we go over a cap. Do we have in that IGA, is there a cap? Hey, if your residents are contributing to our excess capacity and we go over this amount, what is the cost to
Right.
Greeley, to Evans, to say, hey, you gotta pay us for this expansion and.
The way that we treated that, it was that we charged them a system connection fee like anybody else pays. And over the past year, our public works staff, Kaylin Myers, has done a lot of work with their staff to reconcile records about St. Michael's construction and connection to the system. And that resulted in a payment, actually, a one-time payment of about $1.2 million from Greeley that's now in our wastewater fund that will be earmarked for these kinds of improvements. When they come off the system, when they come off of our system, we keep that money. They continue to pay those connection charges if anything else comes online from St. Michael's. Our agreement, I don't believe it does have any kind of firm capacity metric in it for when, they would have to pay something else. Randy, I don't know if you're familiar with anything more.
But the plan is within 3 years, they will be.
They'll be off the system.
They do pay a higher system development fee to Evans than they would pay to Greeley. Ours is higher, and they are paying an out-of-city rate,
Right.
Okay.
which is.
As does Hill Park.
So what's the consequence if within 3 years they're not off the system? Then what?
We have an IDA in the works, we need to bring you early next year to basically rewrite all of that.
Oh, that would be great.
Keeping in mind the lift station, and one other emergency connection that we have, People Ranch, only for emergencies, if there's no station there, lift station there goes down, we receive that bill as well, so we want to clarify our, terms of receiving that. One other thing, I might, just to clarify, the term Hill Park Basin
Right.
does not mean Hill Park, it means literally everything west of 35th Avenue.
Yes, west of 35th Avenue.
The basin itself, not the Hill Park.
Thank you for that.
Arrowhead.
Tuscany, Grapevine Hollow.
Tuscany, Grapevine,
Ashcroft. Heights.
Ashcroft.
That's why the growth has come, that's where that growth has come.
Cave Creek, actually, even though it's on the east side, Cave Creek is in the Hill Park Basin as well.
It's just a name for that area.
Yeah.
Other questions?
I find it distressing news from the complaints that people are already sending out. I don't know, I know that there was some citizen input on this task force back then. So the population growth is part of it, and I'm hoping that you can get in there and see if, where some of this excess is coming from. If it's coming from one particular source, then we probably need to do something with it. But it definitely underscores in my mind that the need to have built this plant in the first place. Because if we were operating with what we had before, we'd really be in serious trouble, probably with the feds and the state, because we didn't have it. And we'd be looking for a different IGA, probably with the city of Greeley to treat our waste.
I guess my final question was, based upon population growth that we've seen the surge of here, and of course, we're gonna continue to grow. In 10 years, even with all of these treatments and all these actions that we try to take, is the wastewater treatment plant now, as it stands, going to be able to meet capacity in 10 years? Based on growth as we're seeing now,
We will have to be building some of these improvements by then. And I believe, Robbie, correct me, but I think the site, there's not a concern about space.
Space, no, I know it feels really tight because we're kind of hemmed in by the Evans ditch. So as we continue, if we go with a traditional expansion, building more trains, more clarifiers, we'll have to relocate the ditch. Granular activated sludge being process intensification would be a small footprint. There would be a little bit of equipment added, but our overall size wouldn't expand much.
Yeah, with process intensification, we can, one of the things we're looking at or would be looking at is this process called biomag, which uses the same material that's in an Etch-a-Sketch. And it's got a very dense specific gravity. We mix it in with the mixed liquor. And mixed liquor normally settles okay, but with this stuff, it settles like a rock, and settling is one of the major problems in wastewater facilities. So we can run the process with more mixed liquor and potentially double the capacity in our existing footprint. As Robbie said, there are a little more energy costs. We do have to add this magnetite, but my gut feeling is that's less expensive than the conventional process in relocating the ditch.
That would be like 5 to 10 million.
I mean, we haven't run any numbers.
We're just roughly.
Yeah, and the conventional one would be double.
So are you
Easy.
able to create kind of like a timeline of like what, like just, I know you have growth, throughout the years, and clearly they were kind of off substantially. I mean, granted, we grew quite a lot. What if you, I don't know, within the 5-year mark, like where would we have to, what year would we have to relocate the ditch? Like what would take us to that level, and what would that cost be over time? Just kind of get an idea of what to plan for in the future, just because granted right now we're having to spend all this money based off kind of like how you mentioned the data was a little suspect. And so I just would like to see what that looks like, because I guess for future planning and where would we have to allocate monies to, assist with the growth and the capacity of the plant.
So one of the things we talk about is we need to lay out the facility plan is to nail down those deadlines, nail down dates, and develop a timeline so people can start budgeting. And that's what Jim was insinuating.
Yeah. Right.
So we hope to have a work session with you again in 3 months or so, where we'll have that information. We'll have more of that facility planning and the options for you, where we can then
And the
have
biomag
answers like
to
that.
see how much capacity it will give us.
Yeah, and that we haven't put pen to paper, but that would be if I had to, that's where I would put my money.
I think for me, there are two primary priorities. The first being obviously getting some sort of capital study done, some needs, capacity, whatever study done to know what our future may look like, so that we can adequately start assessing impact fees as soon as humanly possible. We've got a lot of growth going on, and I think it's advantageous to get that done quickly so that new growth pays for the growth that will be necessary because of it. Beyond that, I think what I'd really like to understand better is when we perform these studies and we have these assumptions, and 5 years later those assumptions are bust, how are we reevaluating that on an annual basis to ensure that we're not here again? So when we looked at it in 2015, 16, 17, 18, where was that look at that point in time to go, wow, we estimated that we would have population growth by 2030 of this much, and here we are in 2025, whatever year, here we are in 2019 with that population growth. What's going on here? Do we have, additional apartments that are being built? Do we have added homes in excess? Whatever it might be. But I think it's incredibly important to the future of our city to be very proactive in looking at these. I feel like we're being a little bit reactive here. And I know that we need to be at this point, but I'd much rather be proactive. So I think that's just what I'd like to consider in the future.
I think a lot of these numbers that were based on back then is, we didn't really have as much weight in growth and development as we do now. I mean, based upon relationships that were out in the community with, prior staff before Jim and everybody here, we didn't have that projected growth because nobody really wanted to do business. Now that we've changed staff, we got a great staff on board. There's people that are now looking at Evans, they're looking to grow, and I think that whole dynamic shift has changed the model than what was expected back then.
I also agree with Councilmember Castle. It's at some point we noticed that these numbers changed, and we should have there should have been some talking.
Right, and one number, council members, that we've looked at, we know what our building activity is each year. One number we haven't spent a lot of time researching now is the 19,000. So if we were a little bit ahead then, because I have a hard time, someone else mentioned 1,000 residents or whatever, that's hard to think through for me too over the last couple of years. Since even then. So again, we are monitoring that building activity. It'll be part of our rate planning. We are updating it. As council knows, we'll be having several discussions next year about long-term Evans build out and where growth is happening and why as part of our comprehensive plan process that we're putting into place now. So we'll have more tools for that kind of ongoing monitoring.
Yeah, that'd be great.
And I'm in full agreement with Councilwoman Castle. The first thing we got to do, growth has to pay for it.
Yep.
So we need to get those as fast as you can. So as far as you're asking for next steps, let's take that one now. I want to backtrack 1 second because I was on the wastewater treatment plant board, and this is just talking about St. Michael's. I know that's not our whole problem, but it is some of the problem. I was flat out told St. Michael's was not going to be on this wastewater treatment plant, and the reason I know that is because this was in 2014, right around there years ago, and that's right when we had gone over our cap. So the mayor at the time and myself, who sat on the wastewater treatment plant, said, well, we're into Greeley for the cap, but they want to tie in St. Michael's into our wastewater treatment plant. Maybe we could use leverage on each other. And flat out was told no, they are not tying into our wastewater treatment plant. So I don't think the ball was dropped at the design of the wastewater treatment plant, including those. I think it was dropped whenever that IGA got brought to us because it wasn't included in there. So that ball got dropped in the IGA, not in the design of the wastewater treatment plant.
The IGA is approaching 20 years old.
Okay, maybe. But I was told, and I know these guys were told, that St. Michael's was not going to be on the wastewater treatment plant. I was told that.
It was at that time, so.
I was told that because I was going to use it against going over the cap with Greeley.
Evans was serving St. Michael's, but I'm hearing the mayor say that
They said they were going to have a lift station back
when we
then.
have our new.
Right.
And that's why I think that updated IGA will be critical
Yeah.
to the success here,
And
knowing if it doesn't happen.
There's some
Right.
consequence to it.
Exactly.
Exactly.
I have a question, and it may be something that you all already look at when the numbers are run. I have read for years now, I read about the growing communities, growing cities, growing counties. For years, I've been reading about Weld County's growth, and I send them on to my upper management so they can see that as well. And just recently, there was another study published that says Greeley and Longmont are gonna be the fastest growing cities. Now, I know we are our own entity, and I'm not saying anything, but is there a way to see what their projected growth was and how
You
it
can.
might have affected ours as well? Because I get a lot of people that come to see me because we're more affordable for what they're looking for versus what's available in Greeley. And I'm sure some of our extra people have probably, maybe they were trying to go to that area and they came to ours. Is there a way to maybe use some of that, see if maybe that affected some of the numbers? And see if maybe that might affect our numbers in the future as well, possibly?
Those trends are going to be helpful for us to know about. The St. Michael's influence is the most direct for us. That's the part of Greeley that we are serving. And as Robbie said, we know what those numbers are. So we are tracking that.
But I'm saying like as a whole. So say we said we were gonna grow, for example, 1,000 people in 1 year, but we actually grew 2,000 or 2,500. Well, what was Greeley's projection for their area at that time? Were they projected at 5,000 and they got 6,500, you know? And we got some of that. That's what I'm saying, like as a whole, as a city as a whole, what is our growth rate comparison to Greeley, for example? Is it more because it's growing more?
There's a direct correlation.
Right, exactly. That's it.
Yep, we can-
Couldn't spit that out.
We can also use them.
So this is a conversation we're gonna have a lot of talk on, obviously, but I think, does anybody else have direction for Jim moving forward for now? Because we have to move on. Is there any other direction Jim needs?
I would recommend that, take advantage of every technical aspect that we can before, and we definitely need to plan and start putting money aside for future expansion. Definitely. This council has been, the mayor has been forward-looking, and we need not to drop the ball and leave it to somebody else and say we can't afford it. And there are a lot of people that are saying that right now over their bills. But they ignored it for 39 years that I've been here. I've heard nothing but we can't afford it. And they've been in and out of compliance with their discharges for that period of time. Even when I lived in Greeley going to college, I was hearing about Evans being out of compliance with their discharges.
Just,
It's all over the
just one final comment. I would want to underscore some good news that I think Patrick had in his letter and we've heard is that in terms of effluent quality and compliance with the state law, state regs, we are doing well. Is that your?
Robbie and
your
staff
take?
are.
And that's really important, because that was a big reason for the need for the plant. So we just need to kind of keep planning here and kind of accommodating what's happening around us.
And then thank you for working on postponing the Regulation 31 as well, all your efforts with that.
You got the direction you need for
Yep,
now, Jim?
certainly do.
Okay, so that'll be a lot of conversations there.
Yeah.
So thank you guys very much.
Thank you.
Next item on the agenda is road tax update. We'll hear from staff.
Thank you, Mayor. We are approaching 2020, and council has tentatively planned for a sales tax election in April to coincide with your municipal election. That could potentially raise some money for maintenance of streets and widening of our streets. We have been working now for several months on a public education initiative that has included town hall meetings and social media videos and education. We've had certainly used the utility bill, all the channels we can think of. We've done direct mailing on the needs for our streets. But coming to the point, probably January, where council might wish to actually place that measure on the ballot. So we wanted to come back to you tonight just to kind of firm up the direction that we've heard, and also hope to resolve one question that's been outstanding regarding the whether council would like to see a sunset provision for the sales tax, which would provide that the tax would end after a certain number of years, and that it could be reauthorized only by the voters. So that's one consideration that frequently, cities use to kind of gain some confidence and some comfort with voters that they'll have a chance to weigh in and discontinue the tax if they don't feel this being used correctly. So I'll just recap where we are, just a couple slides here tonight. You've seen this before in terms of what our standard budget is. It is a little bit higher this year thanks to some extra oil and gas revenue. If we did a 1% sales tax, that would generate approximately $3 million based on current sales tax. So far, the discussion has been that we'd use that tax for both maintenance and for arterial widening. If we used half of that, that would get us an extra $1.5 million for maintenance. If council retained the $600,000 currently allocated, get us a total of $2.1 million for maintenance. That's about 3.5 times that current budget, which would give us, 3.5, almost 4 times the amount of street maintenance we've been able to do, which we believe would make a big difference. One of the outstanding questions from our last session a couple months ago was that we were having the inventory of our pavement condition updated. We have concluded that process. If there's good and bad news, the good news is that our current PCI is approximately where it was last. Remember that high 50s? The consultants who did the update, their data confirms that current PCI is about the average for all of our streets is 58. However, one of the components of that overall PCI is the backlog, what they call the percentage of our streets that have a PCI, the percentage of street segments that have a PCI of 40 or lower, which is in that really poor condition of streets. It's most critical. And that backlog is at 21% of our streets rated are lower than 40. The effect that's had on that PCI model is that, as it will likely cost more in the long run to kind of do the heavy lift to get those streets up into that good category, which means it'll take us a little longer to get to that, to get our streets into good condition. So that's one thing that I wanted to point out, is that as time goes, it had been a couple years since we'd had that inventory update. The condition does continue to deteriorate, especially on our most critical roads. So the urgency is increasingly great. So let's just look at that maintenance again. If this is an illustration of what we would be able to do, we asked our engineering staff, what would your recommendations be over the next 10 years if we had our current budget? And the answer is, well, given the condition of those arterials and collectors, we would focus on them and really, work to do as much as we can with the money we have, and do some overlay treatments where we need to, potentially some chip seal, but focus it on those streets. And this is an illustration of about how much work we could do with the current budget that we have. The next slide shows what we believe we could do if we had that new tax, almost 4 times the amount of work. We'd be able to get in and really resurface most streets in Evans with either the overlay or that chip seal function or chip seal treatment. In the neighborhoods, in most places, that chip seal is going to be the most effective treatment, and that's what you're seeing here. So, assuming council goes forward, this map would be the one that we would, be clear in our communication with the public about, that this is what we would plan to do, acknowledging that there will be some changes from year to year as conditions and financings change. But this is an illustration of what we could do if we had the tax. We look at the arterials. Council might remember from other discussions that we had almost $100 million worth of need for widening those arterials. We divided them up into first and second tier. With the proposed tax, this focuses on those first tier arterials, which are the ones that are most in need and the ones that I think we probably all think of most. And you can see that our current funding, we could probably move forward with about $2.5 million per year. With the half of the sales tax, it's an additional $1.5 million. That could get us, a total of about $4 million. And this is a real high-level summary of those assumptions, but you can just see with the baseline or no new tax, kind of what we could do. It would take us probably 5 years or so to get 37th widened, and then are out to 47th Avenue. Getting out to 65th from there would take probably more than 10 years. Then you get into the more than 2 decades for some of those other improvements. With the new sales tax, you can see, I think, without reading all those years, it's about half the time. So I think in terms of marketing what this could do, we could widen those arterials in about half the time with the new tax. So where we are and where we've heard from council so far is that you would place a 1% sales tax on the April 2020 ballot. It's a penny on the dollar. It would be used exclusively for maintenance and arterial widening. That would include all the services that we need for design and construction, and then also project management, which could be handled either through contract or on-site, city staff, depending on what's more cost effective. And then so far we've heard some interest in the sunset provision, which we'd like to hear more about from you tonight. So really just we're looking for your verifying if this is the direction you'd like to go, and then any additional thoughts on the appropriate sunset period. That concludes our remarks, Mayor Pro Tem.
So I wanted to, I'm of course, I'm all in favor of getting this on the ballot and everything like that, and everything. My thing is with the sunset, yes, there definitely needs to be a sunset, and I know Tammy and Amanda were on the committee with me back in 2018. I think 7 years is a good baseline to start with for a sunset. And the reason why is I don't want, with those priorities, it's a big priority list for 7-10 years. I don't want to overpromise, hey, in 7 years we're going to get this all done, then we're going to underdeliver. 7 years, we can go out there, we're going to get the work done that we can get done. We're going to show them, look, every bit of this money that we said is going to go for this is going for this. Look what we've accomplished. I don't want to say we're going to get all of that stuff done in 7 years. Here's it is. But I want them to at least see in 7 years what we can get done and actually see their money is being spent wisely. So for me, 7 years, I think 10 years is a little too much, 5 years is a little too short. I think 7's about the right in the middle ground there. Also, noticed when I was reading through the packet here, I definitely don't want the money to be split up 50-50. It's got to be used as needed, where needed, and how needed. I mean, there's always going to be opportunities for grants to come available, where money is going to be needed to shift around to fix this road or that arterial or that street. Put money onto the east side, get that stuff done quicker, curb gutters, pave the roads. So I don't want to say it's specifically 50% for this and 50% for that. I want it to be used where needed, as needed, when needed.
I would like to agree with that, everything you said, the sunset, but I'd also like to talk a little bit about the the verbiage that we have saying exclusively for maintenance and arterial widening. I know that we have, a couple of the, streets that are dirt roads that we're intending to pave, and for me, as a citizen, that would not be falling into the maintenance or arterial widening. And I think if we use a different kind of verbiage, maybe, a street construction, road construction,
There you go.
something like that, that would encompass arterial widening if we have, if that's the direction we go. But at least that would also include having, any kind of dirt roads. And we might have a different place, that needs to have a street, a through street. We may need to run it to 23rd. We may need to, put it on 47th or 35th or somewhere else that we have a need. And instead of saying arterial widening, I don't know how you may not have considered this until I mentioned it, that kind of narrows it down to that. And there's a lot of people that are out there that we've heard are a little bit upset about the arterial widening when we're also we're going to use a lot of the impact fees, street impact fees from growth for the arterial widening.
Right.
So, I would just like to see us come up with a different way of putting it so that we can include everything. And I do agree that we do need to use it. We may have to use it more for maintenance at the very beginning. And then we may have to use it a little bit more in 4 or 5 years for, 37th Street or something. So, that's my take. The 1%, we're all on board for that now, and a 7-year sunset. But I would like for the rest of council to consider what I mentioned on that.
I would agree.
I agree with that. Also, 7 years sunset, I think it's a good number. Also, the 1%, for that as well. I have a question though. You mentioned the 21% backlog. That's under 40 PCI. Is that a part of the maps that you showed just recently? Are some of those streets that are at 40 and under in that map?
Yes, they would be.
Can we identify like where those roads are and what that 20% is? I just would like to see it.
Yeah, I believe we could.
And the reason why is because I think that will assist with kind of just looking at everything, for me at least. And what percentage of that 21% will be taken care of with the 1%?
I think when we put that on a map for you, we can answer that question better. I don't have that information right now.
Sounds good. Yes, and I also agree with utilizing the money as needed as well. And then terminology. I think we spoke about that yesterday at the town hall, utilizing different terminology, just because I think hearing street widening, some people will not be keen on that terminology. I think, again, it depends on demographic. If we have our
Construction, is that the
New construction.
well, yeah, it just. Because
As
I think it will favor
utilized,
certain
the wording,
people that
so
are
it's-
worried about, street widening when we have this 21% backlog at 40, and here we are thinking about street widening. Granted, I understand that it's something that's really needed, but for our residents, is it something that they really care about? And able to help with that and letting them, just educating them and, giving them an understanding of what that all means without throwing out words that will deter them. Whatever that word will be.
The going word is construction, so if anybody has an alternative, I want to hear it tonight.
Anything.
Construction.
Yeah.
We also use safety improvements, because that's very much.
Safety.
Yeah, there you go.
I think for me, the biggest priority comes down to, obviously, I'm a very large proponent for this. I think I like the 7 years, and we discussed that at length when we were on the committee, and decided 7 was the best, because as Mayor Pro Tem said, the 5 years is too short, 10 years typically is seen by too long from a public perspective, so 7 years kind of seems like that sweet spot. I'm all for that. Language, you know, as favorable as possible, but if you could not be the last one on the fourth page, that would be great too.
Yeah.
Yes, we won't be this time.
Right, but I think for me, from a financing perspective, I wanna be very methodical about how that money's spent so that we're not having excess costs in future years. So obviously, the cost of projects only increases over time, so I wanna make sure we're doing our due diligence in funding projects as responsibly as possible, so as to save money
Fiscally
to the
responsible.
constituents. You know, I think that's the benefit of the 1% sales tax in total, is that it does provide more funding at the beginning, but if we can utilize that funding in a certain or particular way to help keep costs more current, I think that would be advantageous.
See, that's the reason why we don't want to state specifically that it's split
Exactly
50/50
right. I
because
completely
the
agree.
city can take advantage of those grants when we get them.
Yep.
And they're gonna, as Mark indicated, they may be fewer and farther between.
I agree.
Being able to get them. And I think 7 years is pretty much a standard sunset. It's become kind of a standard sunset provision on most ballot issues. And then you're gonna have to, if you're gonna try to renew that, you're gonna have to try to get that out a year or so before, so you're kind of cutting down the sunset to 6 years.
I apologize, I had to step out, I had an issue there, but got it all taken care of. I've always said a sunset, it's a long seventh number. I think that's perfect, the language that's been discussed, it's perfect for me, and we're gonna get this one home. We need to, as a city, we gotta get our roads fixed.
Are you still looking at getting a committee together for any reason for this?
I'm glad you said it that way, because I, as your city manager, am not.
Sorry, I apologize. Is anyone on record?
But I, as your mayor, he as your mayor is.
Yes.
Yes, I know that work is happening, and I don't know if the mayor, if you guys have any.
No real timeline yet on it, but we are working right now. Mark and I are trying to find the chair. And then with the chair, we're gonna work to pick the committee and get a good solid group going, and we'll all be included on that. I don't think it should just be 2 council members. I think we can all do it. We just gotta post that we're doing it. So I think we should
That's
all be
great.
included.
I just want to make sure that we keep communicating with people. I missed last night's meeting, but the one before, I had heard a few times, again, that it was the city or the city council pushing this off. And I reiterated to the group of people, I said, I wasn't even on city council when we did this, but they went over everything with us. And Amanda had great questions at that. They went over loans, they went over mill levies, they went over grants, they went over, and it was a group of us as citizens that said we think the best and the one that will earn the most money and be the most beneficial would be that 1 cent sales tax. And that's why it was brought to the people. It was brought by the people to the people. And I've just heard a couple times that it's either us or the city pushing or bringing it up. And I've very nicely said, no, it was a group of us that had nothing to do with anything. And we were educated on all the different things, the budgets, everything. And that's why we chose to bring that to the citizens of Evans. So if we could just keep communicating that as well, that might help a bit too.
Yeah, I agree.
2 more, oh, go ahead.
And I attended those meetings until I became a city councilman, and then I could no longer attend them because of the sunshine law, sunset law.
And staff will continue supporting the same way we are now in with videos that talk about the issue, about roads, and with mailings and with all the channels that we can. We just can't be out front with that campaign. Also, Mayor Pro Tem, I know you've encouraged me to send you names of people who've been coming to meetings. Maybe the council, if you have additional names, people who you think who want to be involved, who we haven't heard about, I'm guessing once those emails start to go out about committee meetings and things, those should go to, I'm guessing, the mayor at this point.
That'd be fantastic.
Also something I kind of, just at the town hall yesterday was thinking about, and I kind of spoke to Jim about that, was also using social media to engage the public, and the reason, by educating. So like, for example, like looking at the slides, just kind of doing like pop quizzes, or like, hey, like, I don't know, if we all rally and, acquire $5 gift cards, for a certain amount of time, and then say, hey, like, give us an idea of what does chip and seal do? Like, give us the answer in a form of educating the public and, getting their buy-in, as well as, maybe coming up with, just for future, tax measures, kind of like the police department does a Citizens Police Academy, but doing like a leadership program where we can, like a civic engagement, like teaching them about local government, what we do, and just, providing a certificate, but just to get people to come in and be a part of our city, just finding those different alternatives to engage people, especially, considering with yesterday, our turnout wasn't the best, and so that kind of got me thinking of different ways to reach out.
But I think it will become the due diligence of the committee too, to try and
Right.
work on those avenues.
Exactly.
Primarily because from a social media standpoint, you're gonna get more backlash, which I actually, as frustrating as it can be to have the squeaky wheel, it's advantageous because as the committee, they can respond and say,
Right.
here is the factual data. That becomes really, difficult after we've got the ballot measure for the city to do anything. But if the committee's posting things and doing things, and then people are saying,
Right.
oh, well, we've got this problem, or you're gonna do this with it, whatever it might be, then there's.
Well, yeah.
And we had that
And
as
this
the
is in
committee, we
conjunction
actually
with
had
all
that as
that.
a committee. We were out there engaging, I mean, I know you guys, I know I was, and know.
Hey, I had the lawn signs
knocking
all
on the
over. I was,
doors,
like,
you
putting
know,
them all
talking
over
to
the place.
people, and that's how we got a lot of information, and when it unfortunately failed, we brought back, hey, this is what we heard, this is what they were saying, this is what they thought we should look at. I mean, that's why we were trying all of these different, because when they're passionate about a measure or something, they'll be engaged.
Absolutely.
Great.
Yeah.
That's right. Got what you need, Jim?
I do. Cool, thank you, Jim.
Awesome.
Next item on the agenda is introduction of Drew Lehman, Assistant City Attorney. Lyman? Is it Lyman? Lyman.
I'll invite our city attorney, Scott Krob, up to help with the introduction.
Good evening, council members, mayor and mayor pro tem. It's my pleasure to introduce Drew Lyman, who is our new assistant city attorney. Drew comes to us from Logan County, where he was the assistant county attorney for several years. Before that, he has done municipal prosecutions in San Diego. So started December 9th and has been on staff and on site since then. He'll be handling the municipal prosecutions in Evans Municipal Court, sort of the day-to-day operations, contracts, ordinances, things like that the city staff needs. And then on occasion when I'm not here, he'll be here for council meetings. So feel free to introduce yourselves. I've warned him that there's lots going on in Evans and he'll have lots to do. So, but he is primarily to fill the desire to have an assistant city attorney here 5 days a week available to staff. So this is Drew Lyman.
Good evening. Thank you.
Welcome.
Welcome.
Thank you. Very excited to be here.
Yep.
Mr. Mayor, members of the city council.
The lists are growing. Projects. We've given him a few days.
Yeah.
Yeah, great, thank you.
Thank you.
That's all we have, Mayor and
Yeah.
Council.
Yeah, we'll bother you later.
Got a few
Yeah.
minutes. Anybody got anything for council discussion?
I have none.
I don't have any. Well, how about all the other, I didn't go to the last town hall, not this one, not yesterday's, but the one prior to that. Who all went, and what's your feedback?
It's the same attendance that's been showing up the last ones. I mean, we've been trying to figure out ways to get people engaged. We had that discussion yesterday. Same kind of discussions that we have been. Yeah.
There's one or two new people.
Did we get George's name yesterday? We had on
Yes,
there.
we did. I
Jorge,
made sure
yeah,
I
Jorge.
got that.
It was
He's
quite
got-
interesting. It would be nice to like utilize them because to, capture that demographic. All right. Yeah.
Anything else?
I,
Oh.
very quickly, this is kind of a personal but city thing, and I just think it's a really good story. So I know kind of during the holidays, you hear a lot of bad stories about people taking stuff from your porch or whatever. So the other day, my doorbell rang, and of course, I'm adamant about watching it right now because I
Porch
order
pirates.
everything online. So lo and behold, I had somehow dropped my keys when I was checking the mail, and my mail key is separate from my other keys. And somehow a very young woman in our neighborhood found my keys. And I don't know, I have my Safeway card on there. I don't know if she called Safeway or what, but she figured out the address
Oh, wow.
and delivered the keys
Oh.
back to
Wow.
our house. So in this season of people taking things or whatever, I just want to say thank you to the resident that found my keys and somehow figured out they were mine and very kindly left them on my porch when I was at home. So
That's awesome.
thank
That
you.
is
Yeah,
awesome.
it was a great reminder of how awesome our community is. So.
Yes. Thank you.
All right, we've got 10 minutes.
Awesome.